The little boy reached out from his wheelchair and touched Elvis Presley's face. Elvis was already crying. Not the controlled tears of a man trying to remain composed. His shoulders were shaking. His eyes were red. And in his hands was something worth almost nothing. A piece of paper. A child's drawing. A crooked red heart filled most of the page, and beneath it were 4 words written carefully in crayon. "Thank you for coming." Elvis stared at them. Then the 8-year-old boy whispered something that made him look up immediately. "Mr. Elvis, I'm not scared of dying." The room went completely silent. Elvis froze. For years, he had stood beneath blinding spotlights while thousands screamed his name. He had faced reporters, critics, crowds so loud he could barely hear his own band. But nothing had prepared him for those words. Not from a child. Not from Danny. Danny's body had become frighteningly weak after months of treatment. His hospital gown hung loosely from his shoulders. His hair was gone. Some mornings he barely had enough strength to sit upright. Yet that afternoon, Danny had asked the nurses for one thing. He wanted to meet Elvis Presley. Not for an autograph. Not for money. Not even because Elvis was famous. Danny had something he needed to tell him. When Elvis heard about the request, he quietly arranged a private meeting. No reporters. No photographers. No television cameras. There was no audience waiting to applaud what happened next. Just Elvis and a frightened little boy in a wheelchair. Elvis knelt beside him. Danny held out the drawing. "I made this for you." Elvis smiled gently. "For me?" Danny nodded. "My dad plays your records when I'm hurting." The smile slowly disappeared from Elvis's face. "He says music helps people forget pain for a little while." Elvis looked down. For perhaps the first time in his life, being told that his music mattered left him without words. Then he noticed Tiny writing near the bottom of the paper. 4 more words. "I want to go home." Elvis swallowed. "Why can't you go home, son?" Danny looked toward the floor. "Daddy says we have to stay until the doctors finish helping me." Then came the question Elvis desperately wished the boy hadn't asked. Danny looked directly into his eyes. "Do you think I'm going to get better?" Elvis stopped breathing for a moment. There were questions money could answer. Questions influence could answer. Questions fame could open doors for. This wasn't one of them. Elvis reached forward and took Danny's small hand. "I think you keep fighting." Danny nodded. "I am." Elvis squeezed his fingers. "And I'll fight with you." Danny's eyes widened. "You will." Elvis nodded. "I will." A tiny smile appeared on Danny's face. But then it disappeared. Because Danny hadn't finished. "But what about the others?" Elvis frowned. "What others?" "The kids at my hospital." Danny looked toward the floor again. "There are lots of us." He began counting softly, trying to remember every room, every face, every child he had seen. Then he stopped. He looked back at Elvis. "Maybe 100. Elvis's face changed. Danny continued. "Some of their moms cry when they think we're sleeping." Elvis lowered his eyes. "Some dads don't have enough money." Danny's voice became quieter. "And some kids don't get visitors." Elvis stared at him. Here was a child fighting for his own life. And somehow he was worried about children lying in rooms down the hallway. Then Danny asked, "If you help me, can you help them too?" Elvis broke. He lowered his head. One hand covered his eyes. His shoulders began shaking. Danny watched him, then slowly reached forward. His tiny fingers touched Elvis's cheek. "Don't cry, Mr. Elvis." That only made Elvis cry harder. And before we continue, tell me something. Where are you watching this story from? Write your country or city in the comments. And if stories about compassion, hope, and the side of legends that people rarely see mean something to you, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because Danny was about to ask Elvis Presley for something far greater than an autograph, and Elvis's answer would change far more than one child's life. Elvis finally wiped his eyes. He looked around the quiet room. Gold records hung elsewhere. Awards waited at home. Cars filled garages. Jewelry filled cases. None of it mattered here. Because the little boy sitting in front of him might not have another year. And he wasn't asking Elvis for himself. He was asking for everyone else. Elvis looked at him. "What's your name?" "Danny." Elvis nodded. "All right, Danny." He stood. Danny watched him walk toward the desk. Elvis picked up the telephone. "What are you doing?" Elvis looked back. "You asked me a question." Danny waited. Elvis's expression became serious. "I'm answering it." He made the first call. Then another. Then another. Hospital administrators. Doctors. Specialists. People who handled his finances. At first, nobody understood exactly what Elvis wanted. Then he began asking the same question. Again and again. What do these children need? The answers came quickly. Treatment, medication, special equipment, transportation, rooms for parents who couldn't afford hotels, financial assistance for families whose savings were disappearing because mothers and fathers had stopped working rather than leave their children alone. The list kept growing. Elvis listened. His face became more serious with every answer. Finally, he asked, "How much?" The man on the telephone hesitated. Helping that many families wouldn't be simple. It could become extraordinarily expensive. Elvis interrupted. His voice changed. "I didn't ask whether it was expensive." Silence on the other end. Elvis looked toward Danny. The little boy was watching him. Elvis tightened his grip around the telephone. "I asked what they need." Another pause. Elvis listened. Then he gave the answer. 2 words. Quietly. "Absolutely. Take care of them." The voice on the telephone hesitated. "All of them." Elvis looked directly into Danny's eyes. Danny stopped breathing. Elvis answered. "All of them." Danny's mouth slowly opened. Elvis wasn't finished. Money would be set aside. Families facing crushing bills would receive help. Children needing specialized treatment would be evaluated. Resources would be made available where possible. But Elvis demanded something else. Something money alone couldn't solve. No child should feel forgotten. Toys, books, records, small gifts. Anything that might put a smile on a frightened child's face for even a few minutes. When Elvis finally placed the telephone down, Danny was crying. Elvis immediately returned to him. "Hey!" He knelt. "What's wrong?" Danny wiped his face. "You really did it." Elvis smiled through his own tears. "I told you I'd fight with you." Danny shook his head. "Not just me." Elvis became quiet. Then he placed his hand gently over Danny's heart. "No, son." His voice almost broke. "Nobody fights alone. Danny suddenly leaned forward. Elvis caught him carefully. The little boy wrapped his weak arms around Elvis's neck. Elvis closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Danny whispered, "Can you promise me something?" Elvis opened his eyes. "What?" Danny slowly pulled away. He looked at the drawing still lying on the desk. "If I don't get better." Elvis's face immediately changed. "Danny, please." Elvis stopped. The boy looked at him. "If I don't get better." His voice trembled. "Don't stop helping them." Elvis stared at him. The room seemed to disappear. There was only Danny. Only that drawing. Only that impossible request. Elvis reached for the boy's hand. He held it tightly. Then answered, "I promise." Danny smiled. And neither of them knew that, within weeks, a telephone call would come that Elvis had been terrified to receive. A call about Danny. A call that would make him reach for that crooked red heart again, and wonder whether the promise he had just made would become the most important promise of his life. The telephone rang shortly after midnight. Elvis Presley was alone when he heard it. For a moment, he simply stared at the phone. Something inside him told him not to answer. It had been several weeks since Danny had placed that crooked drawing in his hands. Several weeks since an 8-year-old boy had looked into his eyes and asked him to remember the children lying in rooms beside him. And several weeks since Elvis had made a promise. Nobody fights alone. Since then, things had begun moving quietly behind the scenes. Families who had been drowning beneath medical expenses suddenly received help. Parents who couldn't afford to remain near the hospital were given assistance. Children received toys, books, records, and small surprises. Specialists began reviewing difficult cases. Elvis rarely spoke about any of it. But every few days, he asked the same question. "How, Danny?" Sometimes the answer was encouraging. Sometimes it wasn't. There were good mornings, then terrible nights. Moments when Danny could laugh with the nurses, and others when he barely had enough strength to keep his eyes open. Elvis had learned to fear the telephone, because every ring might carry the words he wasn't ready to hear. Tonight it rang again. He finally picked it up. "Hello." A familiar voice answered. "Elvis." He immediately sat forward. "Yes." A pause. "Too long." Elvis tightened his grip around the receiver. "Is it Danny?" "Yes." Elvis closed his eyes. "What happened?" Another pause. Then the voice said, "Something has changed." Elvis stood. "What does that mean?" The doctors reviewed his latest results. Elvis couldn't breathe. "Just tell me." The voice softened. "He's responding." Elvis froze. "What?" Danny responding to treatment. Elvis lowered himself slowly into the chair. The person continued. There were no miracles being promised. No guarantees. Danny remained seriously ill. There could still be setbacks. But for the first time, doctors were beginning to discuss something his family had almost become afraid to imagine. A future. Elvis covered his mouth. His eyes filled immediately. "Say that again." "He's improving." Elvis bowed his head. A sound escaped him somewhere between laughter and crying. "Thank God." He remained there after the call ended. Alone. Silent. Then he remembered the drawing. Elvis walked toward his desk and opened the drawer. There it was. wrinkled slightly at the corners, a crooked red heart, and those 4 words, "Thank you for coming." Elvis ran his thumb gently across the paper. Then he cried. But these tears were different. They weren't the tears he had shed when Danny asked whether he was going to die. They were tears born from something Elvis had almost been afraid to feel: hope. But Danny wasn't the only child Elvis asked about. The following morning, another call was made. "How are the other families?" There was hesitation on the line. Elvis noticed. "What? You've already done more than anyone expected." "That wasn't my question." "Elvis, how are the families?" The reports came. Some children were improving. Some weren't. Some parents were exhausted. One father had been sleeping in a chair because he refused to leave his daughter's bedside. A mother had nearly lost her job after missing too many shifts. Another family had traveled an enormous distance for treatment and had almost nothing left. Elvis listened to every story. Then he looked at Danny's drawing. "There are lots of us. Maybe 100. Elvis finally understood what Danny had really given him. Not a number. Faces. Families. People who had become invisible behind hospital doors. "Keep helping." The person on the telephone hesitated. "For how long?" Elvis stared at the red heart. "As long as we can." Because by then, the promise wasn't only about Danny anymore. It belonged to every frightened child who believed nobody outside those hospital walls knew they existed. And Elvis had decided they would know otherwise. Days passed. Then something happened that nobody had planned. The story began escaping. A nurse mentioned the unexpected help. A grateful parent told someone. Another family spoke about assistance that had arrived when they had almost given up. Soon, questions began circulating. Who was paying? Who had arranged this? Why were children suddenly receiving gifts? Why were struggling families getting help? Eventually, someone said the name. Elvis Presley. Reporters started calling. At first, Elvis refused to discuss it. He hadn't helped those families to create a headline. But the questions kept coming. Finally, after an appearance, a reporter caught him. "Mr. Presley." Elvis stopped. "We've been hearing stories about a hospital." Elvis's expression changed. "What stories?" "That you've been paying expenses for sick children." Elvis looked away. Another reporter stepped closer. "How many families have you helped?" Elvis didn't answer. "Is it true this began after you met one child?" That stopped him. Elvis slowly turned around. The reporters waited. Then Elvis reached inside his jacket. He removed a folded piece of paper. Carefully, he opened it. The red heart appeared. Elvis looked down at it. Then at the reporters. "You're talking to the wrong person." They stared at him. "What do you mean?" Elvis held up the drawing. "A little boy who was fighting for his own life asked me to remember the children beside him." The room became quiet. Elvis's voice softened. "That's the person you should be writing about." One reporter asked, "Why did you give so much?" Elvis looked back at Danny's drawing. For a few seconds, he seemed to forget the cameras were there. Then he answered, "Because having more than you need means something only if somebody else's suffering becomes lighter because of it." No dramatic speech followed. Elvis folded the drawing, placed it carefully back inside his jacket, and walked away. But the story didn't. People heard about Danny. They heard about the children. And suddenly, something Elvis had tried to do quietly was inspiring strangers to ask what they could do. Cards arrived. Toys. Letters. People offered help. But Elvis remained focused on one thing. Danny. Months after their first meeting, Elvis received another message. Danny wanted to see him. Elvis didn't hesitate. When he arrived at the hospital, the smell brought everything back. The corridors, the nurses, the silence behind certain doors. Elvis walked faster. Then he reached Danny's room. He stopped outside. His hand rested against the door. For some reason, he was nervous. The last time he had seen Danny, the child had been painfully weak. Elvis didn't know what he would find now. He pushed the door open. Danny turned. Still thin. Still recovering. Still unmistakably fragile. But stronger. His face lit up. Mr. Elvis. Elvis's entire expression changed. Danny. He crossed the room quickly. Danny laughed as Elvis embraced him carefully. Elvis pulled back and looked at him. You look different. Danny smiled. So do you. Elvis laughed. I've been working. So have I. Danny lifted his small arm and flexed dramatically. Elvis laughed harder. Then Danny reached beside the bed. I made you something. Elvis stared suspiciously. Not another drawing. Danny grinned. Another drawing. Elvis sat beside him. All right, let me see. Danny handed him a folded page. Elvis opened it and stopped. Dozens of tiny figures filled the paper. Children, parents, nurses, all holding hands beneath one enormous red heart. Elvis stared. What is this? Danny smiled. That's all of us. Elvis couldn't speak. Then his eyes moved toward the bottom of the page. 5 words were written there. Words Danny had borrowed from him. Nobody fights alone. Elvis's eyes immediately filled. Danny watched him. You're crying again. Elvis laughed through the tears. You've got to stop doing this to me. Danny smiled. Then Elvis noticed one tiny figure in the corner of the drawing. Unlike the others, that child wasn't holding anyone's hand. Elvis pointed toward it. Who's that? Danny's smile faded. He looked at the drawing. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then he whispered, That's Tommy. Who's Tommy? Danny looked toward the hospital corridor. He's new. Elvis waited. Danny's voice became quiet. He doesn't have anybody here. Elvis looked back at the tiny figure standing alone. Danny touched his arm. Mr. Elvis. Yes. You said nobody fights alone. Elvis slowly turned toward him. Danny pointed toward the door. Can we go tell him? Elvis stared at the boy, then at the drawing. And in that moment, he realized Danny wasn't asking him for money. He wasn't asking for doctors. He wasn't asking for another gift. He was asking Elvis Presley for something far more difficult to give. His time. Elvis stood. He wiped his eyes, then extended his hand toward Danny. Show me where he is. Danny smiled, and together they moved toward the hospital corridor, unaware that behind the next door was a frightened child whose reaction to seeing Elvis would leave even Danny speechless. The hospital corridor seemed unusually quiet. Elvis Presley walked beside Danny's wheelchair, one hand resting gently on the handle. Neither of them spoke. Danny had just shown Elvis the second drawing. Dozens of children holding hands beneath one enormous red heart. And in the corner, one little boy stood alone. Tommy. He doesn't have anybody here, Danny had said. Now they were moving toward his room. Elvis had performed before crowds large enough to shake buildings. But as they approached the closed door, he felt strangely nervous. Danny pointed. That's his room. Elvis stopped. You've talked to him. Danny nodded. I tried. What happened? He told me to go away. Elvis looked at him. Danny lowered his voice. He tells everybody to go away. Elvis glanced toward the door. Maybe he wants to be alone. Danny shook his head immediately. No. How do you know? Danny looked up at him. Because sometimes when people say go away, they're really asking if you'll come back. Elvis froze. For a moment, the 8-year-old sounded older than everyone in that hospital. Elvis slowly reached for the door. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. A weak voice answered. Go away. Danny looked at Elvis as if to say, see. Elvis almost smiled. Then he opened the door. The room was dark, except for pale afternoon light leaking through the blinds. A small boy lay facing the wall. He appeared even younger than Danny. A tray of untouched food sat nearby. There were no balloons, no flowers, no cards covering the walls, no family photographs. Nothing that suggested anyone was waiting for him outside those doors. Tommy heard them enter. I said go away. Elvis remained near the door. All right. Tommy turned slightly. Then why are you still here? Elvis pulled a chair away from the wall. Because I'm slow. Danny covered his mouth, trying not to laugh. Tommy turned farther. Then he saw who had entered. His eyes widened. He stared at Elvis. Then at Danny. Then back at Elvis. You. Elvis sat down. Me. You're Elvis Presley. That's what people keep telling me. Danny laughed. For the first time, the smallest trace of a smile appeared on Tommy's face. Then it vanished. What do you want? Elvis leaned back. Nothing. Tommy frowned. Everybody wants something. I don't. Then why are you here? Elvis looked toward Danny. This gentleman invited me. Danny sat straighter. Tommy stared at him. Why? Danny answered quietly. Because you're always alone. Tommy's expression hardened. I like being alone. Danny didn't argue. Instead, he wheeled himself closer. Sometimes I do too. Tommy looked away. Elvis watched them. No performance. No dramatic speech. Just two sick children trying to understand each other. Finally, Tommy whispered, My mom can't come. Elvis leaned forward. Why? Tommy said nothing. Danny waited. Then Tommy answered. She has to work. His voice trembled. If she doesn't work, we lose our apartment. Elvis's face changed. My dad left. Tommy pulled the blanket tighter. So Mom works all day and comes when she can. He looked toward the empty chair beside his bed. Sometimes she gets here after I'm asleep. Elvis glanced at that chair. Suddenly, the empty room told an entirely different story. Tommy hadn't been forgotten. His mother was fighting somewhere else. He was simply too young to understand why love sometimes looked like absence. Elvis moved his chair closer. Does your mother know you're angry? Tommy shrugged. I'm not angry. Elvis smiled faintly. Son, I've said that exact sentence enough times to recognize it. Tommy looked at him. Then his eyes filled with tears. I just want her here. Elvis nodded. I know. No promises. No easy answer. He simply sat there. And slowly, Tommy began crying. Danny reached out and placed his hand on the edge of Tommy's bed. Neither boy spoke. Elvis watched them. Then he understood something. He had entered hospitals believing help meant paying bills, finding doctors, buying equipment. Those things mattered. But there were wounds money couldn't touch. Sometimes a frightened child needed something far simpler. Someone who stayed. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Elvis never checked the time. Eventually, Tommy wiped his eyes. Can you sing? Elvis raised an eyebrow. People tell me I can. Danny laughed. Tommy almost smiled again. No microphone. Elvis looked around. Don't see one. No band. Looks like they didn't fit through the door. This time Tommy laughed. A real laugh. Small. Weak. But real. Elvis leaned forward. What do you want to hear? Tommy whispered the name of one of his favorite songs. Elvis nodded. Then, without a stage, without musicians, without cameras, he began to sing softly. Not for thousands. For two boys. His voice barely rose above the hospital machinery. Danny closed his eyes. Tommy stared at Elvis as if the rest of the world had disappeared. A nurse passing the room stopped outside. Then another. Nobody entered. They simply listened. When Elvis finished, Tommy whispered, "Again." Elvis smiled. So he sang again. And when the second song ended, a sound came from the doorway. Someone was crying. Elvis turned. A woman stood there wearing a worn coat. Her hair was untidy. Her face looked exhausted. A grocery bag had slipped from her hand onto the floor. Tommy's eyes widened. "Mom!" The woman covered her mouth. Tommy began crying. "Mom!" She rushed toward the bed. Elvis immediately stood and moved aside. She wrapped both arms around her son. "I'm sorry, baby." Tommy buried his face against her. "I thought you weren't coming." "I always come." She kissed his forehead. "I may be late, but I always come." Elvis turned away, giving them privacy. Danny watched him. He saw Elvis wipe his eyes again. After several minutes, Tommy's mother finally noticed who was standing beside the wall. Her expression changed. "Oh my God." Elvis shook his head gently. "Please." She stared at him. "What are you doing here?" Elvis pointed toward Danny. "Apparently, I'm following orders." Danny grinned. The woman laughed through her tears. Then her face became serious. "I know what you've been doing for some of these families." Elvis didn't answer. She lowered her voice. "Please don't give us money." Elvis looked surprised. "I didn't offer." "I know." She held Tommy tighter. "But if somebody told you about us, I don't want charity." Elvis nodded slowly. "What do you want?" Her answer came immediately. "Time." Elvis frowned. "Time. I work 2 jobs." She looked at Tommy. "If I quit either one, I can't keep our home." Her voice cracked. "If I keep both, my son spends days wondering whether his mother remembers him." Elvis stared at her. And suddenly, he saw the problem differently. Money could pay a hospital bill. But what if it could also buy back something more precious? A mother's afternoon. A father's bedside vigil. A family dinner. Time that poverty had stolen. Elvis asked quietly, "What would happen if your rent and basic expenses were covered for a while?" She froze. "I told you. I'm not asking if you want charity." Elvis stepped closer. "I'm asking what would happen." The woman looked toward Tommy. "I could drop the evening job. And I could be here every afternoon." Tommy stared at her. "Every afternoon?" She touched his face. "Yes." Elvis looked at Danny. Danny was smiling. That evening, Elvis made another call. But this time, his instructions were different. He didn't simply ask which medical bills needed paying. He asked, which families are losing time with their children because they're trying to survive? The answer stunned him. There were many. Parents working double shifts. Families traveling hours every day. Mothers choosing between rent and sitting beside a hospital bed. Fathers sleeping in cars because hotel rooms cost too much. Elvis listened, then gave the instruction. "Find a way to help." The voice on the telephone hesitated. "This could become much bigger than we planned." Elvis looked at Danny's drawing. "Nobody FIGHTS alone." "It already is." Days became weeks. Quiet assistance began reaching more families. But Elvis kept one condition. He didn't want his name turned into an advertisement. He wanted parents beside their children. That was enough. Then one afternoon, Elvis returned to see Danny. The bed was empty. Elvis stopped in the doorway. His heart dropped. A nurse approached behind him. "Elvis." He couldn't turn around. "Where is he?" The nurse smiled. "You should come with me." Elvis finally looked at her. "Where's?" She didn't answer. She led him down the corridor. Past Tommy's room. Past the nurse's station. Toward a set of double doors. Elvis's breathing became faster. "What happened?" The nurse pushed the doors open. Bright sunlight flooded the corridor. Outside, in a small hospital courtyard, stood Danny. Not in his wheelchair. Standing. His legs trembled beneath him. A therapist held one arm. His father held the other. Elvis stopped dead. Danny saw him. A huge smile appeared. "Mr. Elvis." Elvis covered his mouth. Danny lifted one foot. Then another. One tiny step. Then another. Elvis began crying. Danny laughed. "Look. I see you, son." Another step. His knees almost gave way. Everyone moved forward. Danny steadied himself. Then continued. Until he reached Elvis. Elvis dropped to his knees. Danny fell into his arms. The courtyard erupted in applause. Elvis held him tightly. "You did it." Danny whispered into his shoulder. "We did it." Elvis pulled back. "No." He shook his head. "You did this." Danny smiled, then reached into his pocket. "I have something for you." Elvis laughed through his tears. "Another drawing." "No." Danny opened his hand. Inside was a small key. Elvis frowned. "What does it open?" Danny looked toward his father. His father was crying. Then Danny looked back at Elvis. "My front door." Elvis froze. "The doctors say I might go home soon. For several seconds, Elvis couldn't speak. Danny placed the key in his hand. You helped me get back there. Elvis closed his fingers around it. But Danny suddenly became serious. You promised me something. Elvis looked at him. I remember. You won't stop. Elvis stared toward the hospital windows. Behind each one was another room, another family, another child. Then he looked down at the little key in his palm. No, Danny. His voice became firm. We are just getting started. But before Danny could answer, a doctor stepped into the courtyard. Elvis. Something in the man's expression erased the smile from Elvis's face. What is it? The doctor glanced toward Danny, then back at Elvis. There's another child upstairs. Elvis waited. The doctor's voice lowered. And this time, money may not be enough. Danny reached for Elvis's hand. Elvis closed his fingers around the small key, then looked toward the hospital doors. Whatever waited upstairs. He knew one thing. He was going. The small key was still clenched in Elvis Presley's hand when the doctor said the words. There's another child upstairs. Elvis stared at him. And this time, money may not be enough. The joy in the courtyard disappeared. Only seconds earlier, Danny had taken trembling steps into Elvis's arms. Now Elvis looked toward the hospital doors. What does the child need? The doctor hesitated. Something we can't prescribe. Elvis frowned. What? The doctor looked through the glass doors toward the long hospital corridor. Hope. Elvis slowly lowered his eyes. Danny reached for his hand. Go. Elvis looked at him. Danny smiled. You came when I needed you. His voice was weak but certain. Now somebody else needs you. Elvis closed his fingers around Danny's little key. Then stood. He followed the doctor inside. The elevator ride felt endless. Elvis said almost nothing. When the doors finally opened, the atmosphere was different. Quieter. He followed the doctor past several rooms until they reached the end of the corridor. The doctor stopped. Her name is Sarah. Elvis looked through the small window. A young girl lay beneath a white blanket. Her mother sat beside her. What happened? She's been fighting for a long time. The doctor paused. She stopped asking when she could go home. Elvis understood immediately. Sometimes surrender didn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like a child who simply stopped asking about tomorrow. Does she know I'm coming? No. Elvis nodded. Good. He opened the door. Sarah's mother looked up. Her mouth fell open. Elvis immediately raised a finger. Please don't wake her. But Sarah was already opening her eyes. She looked toward him. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then whispered, Elvis. He smiled. Well, now everybody knows I'm here. Her mother covered her mouth. Sarah stared at him. Why? Elvis pulled a chair beside the bed. Why what? Why are you here? Elvis thought about Danny. The first drawing. The 100 children. Tommy. The parents sacrificing everything just to remain near their children. Then he answered, because a friend taught me something. Sarah waited. Elvis leaned closer. Nobody fights alone. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm tired. Elvis's smile disappeared. I know. No, you don't. Sarah turned toward the wall. I'm tired of needles. Her voice trembled. Tired of people telling me to be brave. Her mother began crying silently. Sarah continued. Everybody keeps saying, I have to fight. Elvis didn't interrupt. But what if I'm tired of fighting? The room became painfully quiet. Elvis could have offered an easy answer. He didn't. Instead, he reached toward her hand. You're allowed to be tired. Sarah slowly turned back. Elvis continued. Being brave doesn't mean pretending nothing hurts. He squeezed her fingers. Sometimes it means letting somebody sit beside you while it does. Sarah stared at him. Then tears rolled down her cheeks. Elvis stayed. No cameras. No reporters. No stage. He simply stayed. And as the afternoon faded, Elvis began to understand the lesson Danny had been trying to teach him from the beginning. Helping people wasn't always about changing the ending. Sometimes it was about changing the part they had to endure alone. Days passed. Elvis continued asking about Danny and the other children. The arrangements he had started grew larger. Families facing impossible expenses received assistance. Specialized treatment was considered where needed. Transportation was arranged. Parents struggling to remain close to their children received help. And gifts continued arriving. Toys, books, records, small reminders that somebody outside those hospital walls remembered they existed. But something else was happening. People had discovered what Elvis had done. The story was spreading. Reporters wanted numbers. How much had Elvis given? How many children had been helped? Why hadn't he announced it? One afternoon, Elvis found himself surrounded by reporters. A microphone appeared in front of him. Mr. Presley, people are calling what you've done extraordinary. Elvis looked uncomfortable. Another reporter asked, why would one of the biggest entertainers in the world become personally involved in something like this? Elvis reached inside his jacket. He removed a folded piece of paper. The first drawing. Danny's crooked red heart. He unfolded it carefully, then held it up. You're talking to the wrong person. The reporters became silent. Elvis looked at the drawing. A little boy who was fighting for his own life asked me to remember the children beside him. His voice became quieter. That's the person you should be writing about. A reporter called out. But why give so much? Elvis looked down at the red heart, then answered, because having more than you need means something only if somebody else's suffering becomes lighter because of it. Nobody immediately asked another question. Elvis folded the drawing, then walked away. He had no idea that the most emotional moment was still ahead. Months after their first meeting, Elvis returned to the hospital. He carried Danny's original drawing inside his jacket. But this visit felt different. The nurses were smiling. One of them stopped Elvis in the corridor. He's waiting for you. Elvis smiled. Where's? She pointed ahead. Elvis entered. Danny was there. Still thin. Still recovering. But stronger. And the instant he saw Elvis, his entire face lit up. Mr. Elvis. Elvis laughed. There's my troublemaker. Danny held something behind his back. Elvis narrowed his eyes. What have you got? Nothing. You're a terrible liar. Danny laughed, then revealed another piece of paper. Elvis placed his hands on his hips. Another drawing. Danny nodded proudly. Another one. Elvis sat beside him. All right, let's see it. Danny handed it over. Elvis unfolded the paper, then stopped breathing. Dozens of tiny figures covered the page. Children, standing side by side, holding hands. Above them was an enormous red heart. Elvis stared at it. What is this? Danny smiled. That's all of us. Elvis's eyes immediately filled. Then he saw the words at the bottom. Nobody fights alone. Elvis covered his mouth. Danny laughed softly. You're crying again. Elvis nodded. I know. You cry a lot. Elvis laughed through his tears. You keep drawing things that make me cry. Then Danny opened his arms. Elvis leaned forward. The 8-year-old wrapped his arms around him. And for several seconds, the king of rock and roll simply cried beside a child. No spotlight could have made that moment bigger. No audience could have made it more important. Danny whispered, Did you help them? Elvis pulled back. Who? The 100 kids. Elvis stared at him. He remembered Danny sitting weakly in the wheelchair. Maybe 100. Some mothers crying. Some fathers without enough money. Some children without visitors. Elvis nodded. We helped as many as we could. Danny smiled. We. Elvis pointed toward him. You started it. Danny shook his head. You did it. No. Elvis held up the drawing. You reminded me what I could do. Danny became quiet. Elvis placed the second drawing beside the first. 2 pieces of paper, worth almost nothing. Yet Elvis treated them like treasures. The world knew him for the voice, the movement, the records, the crowds, the clothes, the fame. But none of those things explained what happened inside that hospital. Because greatness is easy to recognize beneath a spotlight. The harder question is, who are you when there is no stage? Who are you when the person sitting in front of you can give you nothing? No fame, no money, no opportunity, nothing except trust. Danny had given Elvis a child's drawing, a crooked red heart, and a request. If you help me, can you help them too? In return, Elvis had used what he possessed to make the burden lighter for families who felt as though the world had forgotten them. But Danny had given Elvis something too. A lesson. If you have enough strength to lift one person, lift them. If you have enough power to help many, don't stop at one. Elvis eventually stood to leave. Danny called after him. Mr. Elvis. Elvis turned. Danny smiled. Thank you for coming. Elvis looked down at the first drawing. Those exact words. He walked back, knelt beside Danny, and whispered, No, son. Elvis placed his hand over Danny's heart. Thank you for asking. Danny smiled. Elvis walked into the corridor. He carried both drawings with him. Behind one hospital door was Danny. Behind another was Tommy. Behind others were children Elvis might never meet. Families whose names the world might never know. But Danny had made sure Elvis knew they were there. And sometimes, that is where change begins. Not with a stadium, not with a fortune, not with applause, but with one frightened child having enough compassion to whisper, There are others like me, and one man having enough humanity to answer, Then we'll help them too.